The storm had broken sometime after midnight. By morning, the city was quiet, washed clean and strangely hollow. James sat by the window of his high-rise apartment, watching the raindrops crawl slowly down the glass. His phone lay dark beside him, a single unread message glowing faintly. "Call me when you can, Mum." He hadn't replied, not for weeks. The company had collapsed almost overnight. Investors gone, assets frozen, headlines merciless. The fall of a modern visionary, that was the phrase the press liked best. He had spent years building his name into something unshakable, and now even his silence was being quoted. The tea on the table had gone cold. He hadn't touched it. The city below looked like it was moving underwater, slow, muffled, unreachable. When the knock came, he didn't move. Then again, softer, a familiar rhythm. He opened the door, expecting no one. But there she was, his mother. Umbrella dripping, coat soaked through, her small frame somehow still steady. "Thought you'd forgotten where I lived," he said, trying for humor but finding none. "I did," she replied quietly, setting her umbrella aside. "But I also thought you might have forgotten where you came from." Her voice was gentle, not sharp, the kind that didn't argue, only lingered. She looked around the apartment, eyes tracing the mess. Unopened letters, half-eaten meals, a life that had stopped mid-motion. She didn't say anything, just walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and began to make tea, the way she always had. He watched her in silence, the faint whistle of the kettle filling the space between them. "How did you even get up here?" he asked eventually. "Lift still works. Not everything's broken." He almost smiled. Almost. When she handed him the cup, her hands brushed his, cool against his heat. He didn't drink. She did. She always did. "I used to think success meant never needing anyone. That if I worked hard enough, built enough, I could stay ahead of everything." She didn't answer. Instead, she walked closer, her gaze following his to the skyline, that familiar gray stretch of glass and fog. "Do you remember when you built your first tower from cardboard? You were 6. It kept leaning to one side, but you wouldn't stop. You said, 'It's not falling, it's learning.'" I laughed, barely. "I said that?" "You did, and you meant it." He turned then, for the first time really looking at her. The lines on her face were deeper, but her eyes, the same quiet blue, steady, patient, the kind that had weathered storms far worse than his. "How did you do it?" he asked after a pause. "All those years. Raising me, working, losing Dad." She shrugged, stirring her tea. "One day at a time. Some days badly, some days better, but I never confuse falling with failing." He looked down at his hands, the tremor in them small but certain. Outside, the rain began again, soft this time, like memory. His mother moved toward the window, watching the reflection of the city lights in the wet glass. "You built something once. You can build again. Maybe not what the world expects, but what you need." He didn't answer. Couldn't. But when she turned to go, he found himself saying, "Stay for a bit." "I'll put the kettle on again," she said, smiling slightly. And as she did, something shifted, barely noticeable, like the slow clearing of fog. The flat was still silent, still cold, but now it wasn't empty. The rain outside softened into mist, wrapping the city in a faint, silvery blur. His mother moved quietly through the kitchen, her small steps making barely a sound against the marble floor. James watched her without speaking, the way one studies something both familiar and foreign. She found a clean towel, dried her hands, and began rearranging things. Plates, cups, a forgotten pile of unopened mail. Nothing intrusive, nothing commanding, just small movements that made the space breathe again. "Tea's better the second time," she said, setting the new cup in front of him. He nodded, but didn't touch it. His reflection trembled faintly in the amber surface of the drink. She noticed, of course, but didn't mention it. She never had to. The flat looked different now. Same furniture, same light, but her presence had changed the air somehow, softened its edges. It reminded him of his childhood flat, the sound of an iron hissing against cloth, the hum of a cheap radio, her quiet singing between chores. "I don't know how you kept going," he said finally. Her mother glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Neither did I just did." He almost smiled. "That simple?" "Nothing simple about it, but most of what keeps us alive isn't dramatic. It's small, ordinary things done again and again, until they stop feeling heavy." She dried her hands and came to sit opposite him. The chair creaked softly, the same way it had when he was a boy, when she'd help with homework or patch up scraped knees, both of them pretending life was easier than it was. "I used to think you were unbreakable," he said. Her lips curved slightly. "I wasn't. I just broke quietly." They sat in silence after that. Not awkward, but full, like the pause between two verses of a song. Outside, the clouds began to break. Light slid through the room, slowly, resting on the small things, the chipped mug, the framed photo by the counter, the faint steam rising between them. She leaned back. "You remember that market we used to go to, down on Haverfield Road?" He nodded. "The one with the noisy fishmonger and the broken trolleys?" "That's the one. Every Saturday I'd buy bruised apples because they were half price. You used to complain. I said they were ugly. You did. And I told you that ugly things can be good too if you don't throw them away too soon." He smiled for the first time that day. "You still buy bruised apples?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "Old habits are honest ones." The silence returned, softer now. He finally lifted the cup, took a slow sip. The taste was stronger than he remembered, less sweet, more real. She watched him, then looked away. "You should eat," she said, standing up. "I'll cook something." "You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted gently, "but I want to." He didn't argue. Couldn't. She moved around the kitchen with that same calm rhythm he remembered, not rushed, not hesitant. The sound of the knife against the board, the sizzle of onions, the soft hum she made without realizing. All of it wove something back together that had been torn too long. He sat, quietly, watching. Every small movement, the way she wiped the counter, tasted the sauce, opened the window to let the steam out, was a kind of language, the kind that didn't use words, only presence. When she finally set the food before him, he realized he hadn't eaten properly in days. The warmth hit him before the flavor did. He ate slowly, the spoon trembling once before he steadied it. She sat across from him, sipping her tea, eyes half lowered. For the first time in months, he felt something close to calm. Not relief, not joy, just the absence of ache. After they ate, she stood, washed the dishes, and began tidying again, her rhythm unbroken. "Stay tonight," he said suddenly. She looked at him, surprised, but not startled. "Are you sure?" "Yeah. Just stay." She smiled then, soft, almost invisible, and nodded. Later, when the city lights dimmed and the rain began again, he walked past her room. The door was half open. She was asleep already, one hand resting on a folded jumper by the bed, the way she used to when she couldn't afford pillows. He stood there for a long moment, the light from the hallway stretching thin across the floor. There was a quiet hum in his chest. Not pride, not guilt, but something simpler. In the silence of that flat, he understood something he hadn't in years, that strength was never the noise that survived the fall, but the hand that still knew how to make tea when everything else had stopped working. He went back to the window, looked out at the city, and whispered to the glass almost unconsciously, "She never stopped building." The city looked the same, only he wasn't.
The city looked the same, only he wasn't. Morning came slowly, through pale light and the smell of rain clinging to the window panes. James hadn't slept much, though for once it wasn't because of worry. It was the quiet, too full, too steady, almost unnerving after months of noise. He walked into the kitchen to find his mother already there, sleeves rolled, making tea. The kettle clicked softly, releasing a whisper of steam that wound its way into the air. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, without turning. Didn't want to. The silence felt different. She smiled faintly, pouring water into 2 cups. "Silence isn't empty, you know. It just speaks quietly." He sat at the table, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. It was strange how easily she belonged in any space, not by claiming it, but by softening it. For a while, neither spoke. The clink of the teaspoon against porcelain filled the room. The calm wasn't forced. It was alive, breathing in its own rhythm. He broke the silence first. "Do you ever regret not doing more with your life?" Her eyes lifted, amused. "I did plenty. I mean, more. Traveling, maybe. Building something big." She thought for a moment. "I built you." He exhaled, almost laughing. "You make it sound simple." "It wasn't simple," she said, stirring her tea. "But it was enough." Outside, light spilled slowly through the fog. The streets below began to stir. Buses, early workers, a cyclist cutting through puddles. Life, carrying on. She leaned back, watching him the way she used to when he was a boy struggling with puzzles. "You know, when you were little, you never liked losing. Even at board games, you'd knock the whole thing over before admitting defeat." He smiled, half remembering. "You used to say I was dramatic." "You were," she said, laughing quietly. "And I told you something then. Do you remember?" He shook his head. "You can start again from where you stopped, but only if you stop fighting the silence first." He looked at her for a long moment, unsure why those words landed differently now, heavier, sharper. Later that day, they left the apartment. She insisted on walking instead of taking the car. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and daisies, like something waking up. The city breathed around them, alive but gentle, as though the world had slowed to listen. He said nothing, just sat there, the sound of traffic far away, the bench creaking beneath their quiet weight. A child's laughter echoed nearby, a small boy running after a paper plane that refused to fly straight. James watched him, eyes following the way the boy laughed even as it fell. His mother spoke again, barely above a whisper. "There's your answer, love. That's how you begin again." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. They sat there until the light began to change, until the sky faded from gray to pale gold. When they stood, neither said much, but something unspoken had shifted. Not between them, but within him. Back at the apartment, she brewed another pot of tea. He stood by the window, watching his reflection blur into the city outside. She handed him a cup. "For tomorrow," she said. "What's tomorrow?" "Another chance. Same as every day." He nodded, looking out at the skyline. Familiar, yet new. The city hadn't changed, but now it looked alive again. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, he didn't think about rebuilding his empire.
He thought about breathing, about beginning differently. As his mother moved behind him, tidying the counter, humming softly, he felt something steady return. Not confidence, not clarity, but presence. And for that night, it was enough. The kettle began to hum again, soft, rhythmic, certain. The kettle's hum faded into the background, steady as a heartbeat. The next morning, the city woke under a pale stretch of sunlight. James stood by the window, cup in hand, his mother humming softly behind him as she tidied the kitchen. She looked at him and said, "You should get out for a bit. Take a walk somewhere that reminds you who you were before all this." He frowned. "And where's that supposed to be?" She smiled. "You'll know when you see it." He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing with her long ago, mostly because she always turned out to be right in ways that took time to understand. An hour later, they were in her car, driving out of the city. The roads narrowed. The glass towers dissolved into rows of old terraces, corner shops, small lives unfolding in steady rhythms. He hadn't been there in years. The neighborhood where he'd grown up, the place he'd spent his childhood dreaming of escape. It looked smaller now, the streets thinner, the trees older, yet it carried a kind of quiet dignity he hadn't seen before. His mother parked near the corner where a bakery once stood. The sign was faded now, the scent long gone, but the memory came rushing back. The smell of warm bread, her hand wrapped around his coins tight in his fist for a single roll. "Still the same?" she said, stepping out. "Not really. Everything's changed." She looked at him, eyes calm. "That's what people say when they're the ones who've changed." They walked slowly down the pavement. Children's laughter floated from somewhere behind a row of houses. A bicycle bell rang, a door creaked open, a curtain fluttered open. Ordinary sounds, the kind he'd stopped noticing years ago. "Remember that alley?" she said, pointing. "You scraped your knee there. You cried until Mrs. Finch gave you a biscuit." He smiled faintly. "I remember thinking that biscuit was magic. It wasn't. Just sweet enough to make you forget the sting." They turned a corner and stopped outside a small building, their old flat. The door was painted blue now, brighter than he remembered. A flower pot sat on the step, overflowing with small white daisies. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "I used to sit right there, on that step, after work, after putting you to bed, just to breathe." He looked at her, surprised. "I don't remember that." "You weren't supposed to," she said simply. "You were supposed to sleep." He followed her gaze to the window above. "You didn't have much then." "I had enough," she said. "It just looked smaller because I was standing inside it." The words lingered. He found himself staring at the small details, the cracks in the wall, the uneven brick, the faint hum of a neighbor's radio. The kind of life he'd once wanted to outrun, now quietly teaching him what he'd forgotten. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes, but not for what it was, for who I was in it." They stood there for a while, not talking. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and fresh paint. Somewhere nearby, a kettle whistled through an open window. She smiled faintly. "Every house has that sound," she said. "That's how you know someone's still trying." He didn't know what to say. Instead, he walked toward the step and sat down. The stone was cool beneath his hands. He imagined her there, younger, quieter, carrying weight he'd been too young to notice. "I used to think you were waiting for something," he said softly. "A better life, a break."
She shook her head. I was just waiting for the noise in my head to stop. He turned to her, then back at the house. And did it? She smiled, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, but carried peace all the same. Eventually, the wind stirred. The daisies on the step trembled slightly, scattering a few petals. He reached out and caught one before it fell. His mother watched, eyes warm. You see, some things still land softly. They stayed there until the light began to change, shadows lengthening, the street glowing gold with evening. A man across the road watered his plants. Someone's radio played a tune too old to name. James exhaled slowly, the sound almost like a sigh, almost like release. I used to hate this place. Now it feels safe. It always was. You just couldn't see it while you were running. He looked up at the sky, now streaked with faint pink. Maybe I stopped running. She nodded once. Then you've already started again. As they walked back to the car, he glanced once more at the window, their old light still flickering faintly inside, as if it had never really gone out. He didn't say it out loud, but he thought it. This was where she learned how to keep going, and where I've learned how to begin again.
The road back to the city was quieter this time. The traffic moved slow, sunlight flickering through the windscreen in soft, uneven rhythm. James sat in the passenger seat, watching buildings rise and blur past. But his mind stayed behind, at that blue door with the daisies trembling in the wind. His mother drove without music, one hand resting on the wheel, the other tapping gently in time with her own thoughts. Neither spoke for a long while. Halfway home, she said, "You know, failure isn't wasted. It's just expensive education." He glanced at her. "And what did it teach you?" "To stay kind," she said simply, "especially when it hurts." He looked away, out the window again. The skyline grew closer, but it no longer felt like arrival, just continuation. Later that week, he returned to his office for the first time in months. The building still carried his name, though the staff had thinned, the desks half empty. Dust had settled where ambition once buzzed. He walked through the corridors slowly, hand grazing the glass walls, remembering the echo of his own confidence there. In his old office, the air was still. The city sprawled beneath the wide window, bright and cold. He stood for a long time, then opened the drawer of his desk. Inside were fragments of the past, a company brochure, a photo from the launch day, his son's old drawing of Dad's big building. He set the photo down and looked around. The space that had once felt like triumph now looked hollow, like a shell. That afternoon, his mother arrived. She'd brought sandwiches and 2 flasks of tea, carried in an old cloth bag she'd used for years. "Thought you'd forget to eat," she said. He smiled. "You came all this way for that?" She shrugged. "Old habits." They sat on the office floor, backs against the wall, eating quietly. It felt absurd, almost childlike, sitting cross-legged among the ghosts of ambition. But the laughter that followed was light, unguarded. "I used to think this view meant I'd made it," he said, looking out at the skyline. "And now? It just looks like somewhere people keep trying." She nodded. "Trying is good. It's living in disguise." The next day, James called his lawyer, not to reopen his company, but to start something smaller, a fund for single parents looking to build businesses of their own. No press release, no grand announcement, just quiet beginnings seeded from endings. His mother helped him name it the Second Start Fund. He spent the next weeks meeting people, mothers, fathers, small business dreamers, listening more than speaking. For the first time, he wasn't trying to lead. He was learning again. One afternoon, he visited a local community center, the same one where his mother used to volunteer years ago. The room smelled faintly of dust and tea, filled with quiet voices and tired eyes that still held hope. A young woman stood by the notice board, papers trembling slightly in her hands. She was applying for a small grant. "I'm not sure it'll work," she said when he asked. "Feels too small to matter." He smiled. "Small things are honest things," he said. "You'd be surprised how far they go." She nodded, uncertain, but her eyes softened. When she left, his mother, who had been helping in the corner, looked at him, not with pride but with recognition. "You sound like someone I used to know," she said. He laughed. "Who?" She said, "A woman who bought bruised apples and made them last the week." He looked down, smiling. "You always did more than you said." She shrugged lightly. "That's how you keep it sacred." Outside, the day was ending, pale light folding into evening. They stood by the door, the hum of traffic low and steady, a bus sighing as it stopped nearby. James turned to her. "You think it's enough, this small start?" She looked up at him, eyes kind. "It always is if it begins with care." He nodded slowly. For once, there was no rush in him, no hunger to prove, only a steady calm that had once belonged to her, and now, somehow, belonged to him, too. As they walked home, she slipped her arm through his, a gesture simple and familiar. He looked at her and thought of all the times she'd carried both of them through storms without ever calling it bravery. The city glowed ahead, vast, indifferent, alive. But now it no longer intimidated him. It felt like a landscape waiting to be tended, not conquered. At the next crossing, the light turned green. She said quietly, "Keep walking, love. Just keep walking." He smiled. "I will." And as they crossed the street together, the evening wind lifted faintly, carrying the scent of rain, tea, and daisies. The wind carried the scent of rain, tea, and daisies. Soft, familiar, almost like memory returning home. Weeks folded into months, quietly. The world didn't change overnight. It rarely does. But the small things began to grow. The Second Start Fund became less of a program and more of a pulse. It moved through people's lives in quiet ways. No headlines, no speeches, just beginnings. There was Nadia, a mother of two who'd once sold handmade candles from her kitchen. With the fund's help, she rented a small stall at the weekend market. One rainy afternoon, James visited, unannounced. She was arranging her candles in neat rows, each with handwritten labels. "They smell like home," he said. She smiled shyly. "That's what I wanted them to do." Then there was Aaron, a quiet man rebuilding his life after losing everything in a failed venture. The fund helped him start again, not with money alone, but mentorship. When James met him, Aaron said, "It's strange. I thought I lost everything. Turns out I'd just lost my hurry." James smiled. "That's when you start seeing clearly." These weren't big stories, but they were real, the kind that quietly refused to fade. And somewhere within each of them was a trace of his mother, her patience, her steadiness, her refusal to give up on what still had life left in it. On certain afternoons, she'd still visit the center, helping with tea, paperwork, and conversation. She never introduced herself as his mother. She didn't need to. People sensed it in the way she listened, like every word mattered, every pause deserved space. One day, James found her sitting in the community hall, surrounded by a group of new applicants. The air smelled of old wood and sunlight. She was teaching them how to keep records, neat, careful, honest. Always write what you've spent and never lie to the page. It remembers. He stood in the doorway, unseen for a while, watching her. The same calm rhythm, the same presence that once held his world together. After the session, she walked up to him, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You were eavesdropping." He laughed. "Just learning." "Again?" she teased. "Always," he said. They walked outside, the sky washed with that soft blue that comes only after rain. People passed them, some he knew, most he didn't. A few nodded, a few stopped to thank him. But what struck him most was how those thanks didn't feel like applause. They felt like connection. Later that evening, back at the flat, he found his mother by the window again, her cup half full, her gaze far away. "You've changed things," she said softly. He shook his head. "I just started something small." She smiled. "That's how change starts." They sat together, watching the city lights flicker alive, one window at a time, like stars finding their place in a man-made sky. He spoke quietly. "Do you ever wonder what people will remember you for?" "I don't think about that," she said. "I just hope they remember how they felt when they were with me." He looked at her, really looked, and realized that was exactly what her legacy already was. Not money, not survival, presence. A message pinged on his phone. Nadia again. A photo of her stall, now bigger, with a small sign above it. Hope. Handcrafted. Below it, she'd written, "Tell your mom thank you for the tea last week. I sold out." His mother chuckled softly when he showed her. "Tea solves most things," she said. "Apparently," he smiled. As night deepened, he stood by the same window he once stared out of, in silence. Now that silence was full, alive, with stories he hadn't written, but had somehow helped begin. Down below, he could see movement, people crossing streets, carrying groceries, laughter spilling from a nearby cafe. Ordinary lives, continuing. And for once, he didn't feel like an observer. He felt part of it. Behind him, the kettle began its familiar hum again. Low, constant, certain. His mother poured 2 cups, setting one beside him. He looked at her, then at the steam rising between them, curling like quiet gratitude. "Funny, everything starting with a cup of tea." She smiled. "Everything worth keeping usually does." And as the city breathed around them, the ripples spread, unseen, unstoppable, reaching further than either of them would ever know. The city moved beneath them, a steady pulse of light and motion. Between the 2 cups of tea, steam curled softly, rising and fading into the evening air. James leaned against the window, his reflection merging with the skyline, half memory, half man. Weeks passed in quiet rhythm. The fund continued to grow, though he rarely spoke about it. There were no interviews, no newspaper features, no applause. Just letters, handwritten, often folded clumsily, arriving in small envelopes at his office desk. Each began differently, but all carried the same echo. Thank you for believing in small beginnings. He kept them all in a box, nothing ornate, just a wooden one his mother had given him years ago. On the lid, faintly carved, were the words, "Begin again." He'd run his fingers over those words sometimes, late at night, when the flat had gone still and the only sound left was the soft hum of the city breathing. One afternoon, he came home to find his mother in the kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of flour. She was baking, something she hadn't done in years. The scent of butter and sugar filled the air, warm and nostalgic. "What's the occasion?" he asked. She smiled without looking up. "Do I need one?" "I suppose not." "Besides," she said, dusting her hands, "you've been too serious lately. The world doesn't always need fixing, love. Sometimes it just needs feeding." He laughed quietly. "That sounds like something you'd put on a tea towel." She looked at him then, eyes narrowing playfully. "Maybe I should." When the cake was in the oven, she poured 2 cups of tea and sat with him by the window. The city outside was turning gold, rooftops catching the last of the light, clouds soft as breath. He spoke first. "You know, for the longest time, I thought you were surviving, just getting through things. And now? Now I see you were teaching. Every small thing you did, every quiet choice, it built something. I just couldn't see it back then." She smiled, eyes reflecting the fading light. "That's how lessons work. They don't tell you what they're teaching until you need them." He nodded, gaze steady on hers. "You know, people always talk about success as if it's some finish line. But I think it's this, sitting here, having tea, knowing I didn't lose myself trying to win." Her hand reached across the table, resting lightly on his. "Then you've learned what matters."
They sat there, the silence wrapping around them like soft cloth. Outside, the hum of evening traffic blended with the faint whistle of a kettle from another flat, a sound that always seemed to follow them. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly. "All the noise, the rush?" He shook his head. "No, I miss nothing. I think I've finally arrived where I was supposed to be." Her eyes softened. "And where's that?" He looked at her, smiling. "Here." The word hung in the air, simple, quiet, complete. After a moment, she stood and checked the oven. The smell of baked sugar filled the flat. "You'll take some to the center tomorrow," she said, cutting the cake. "They like something sweet after hard days." He nodded, watching her. Her movements were slower now, but sure. Stillness had always been her strength, not the absence of motion, but the grace inside it. She turned with the plate, offering him a slice. "Try this, it's new." He took a bite and, for some reason, it reminded him of childhood. Sunday mornings, laughter, a small kitchen filled with sunlight and patience. He looked at her again, and the recognition came like light. Not sudden, but sure. He had spent his whole life trying to become extraordinary, only to realize the most extraordinary thing he ever known was sitting across from him, stirring tea, smiling quietly, unbothered by the need to be seen. He exhaled slowly, the warmth of the moment settling deep. "Mum," he said softly, "I don't say it enough, but I see you." She smiled. "Not wide, just enough. You always did. You just had to stop looking past me." The kettle clicked off again, right on cue. The same steady hum that had underscored their entire lives. They poured another round of tea, though neither really needed it. Some rituals weren't about thirst. They were about staying connected to what held you steady. Outside, the lights shimmered. Inside, the quiet deepened. Not empty, but whole. And as the evening slipped into night, James realized something simple, something vast. He hadn't just rebuilt his life, he had finally learned how to live it.
The seasons shifted quietly, as they always did. Autumn came early that year, leaves turning brittle before their time, light falling shorter in the evenings. The city began to wear its soft grays again. James noticed it first, not in his mother's face, but in her pace. The way she took longer to climb the stairs, how she'd pause midway to look out the window and pretend she was only admiring the sky. "You all right, Mom?" he'd ask gently. She'd smile, the same small smile she'd worn her whole life. "I'm just catching my breath. The world's moving faster these days." He wanted to believe her. Maybe for a while, he did. Days folded into weeks. She still came to the community center, still made tea, still called him love in that way that made everything feel grounded. But sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she'd sit down mid-task, her hand resting lightly on her chest, eyes closed, as if listening to something only she could hear. One evening, she didn't go out at all. The rain had begun early, soft and steady, the kind that soaked the world in quiet melancholy. James found her by the window, wrapped in her cardigan, a blanket over her knees. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. "I am, just not from living." He smiled faintly, joining him with 2 cups of tea. "Still can't sit still, can you?" "Not when there's so much light left to see," she murmured. They sat there for a long time, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass. The silence wasn't heavy, it was gentle, like an old song you don't quite remember the words to, but still hum along. Later that night, he tucked her into bed. She pretended to protest, but her voice was soft, almost playful. "You'll spoil me, love." He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Someone should." She laughed quietly. "Took you long enough." He turned off the light, but she reached out, fingers finding his hand. "Leave the lamp," she whispered, "just for tonight." The glow filled the room, warm, tender, almost golden. He sat by her side long after she'd drifted to sleep. Her breathing was slow but steady, her face peaceful. On the bedside table sat her old notebook, the one she'd used to jot down shopping lists, recipes, reminders. He opened it carefully, half expecting the pages to crumble. On the very last page, written in her familiar looping script, were just 4 words. "Keep building. Keep beginning." He closed the notebook, pressing his palm against it as though it were something living. Morning came softly. Pale light filtered through the curtains, brushing the edge of the room. The kettle in the kitchen clicked on automatically, a sound so ordinary it almost felt sacred. He rose quietly, made 2 cups of tea out of habit, then paused. Only 1 cup would be needed now. He stood by the window, the same place where she had stood countless times before. Outside, the city glowed faintly under the morning mist. Somewhere in that light, he could almost hear her voice, gentle, certain, unhurried. "Don't stop now, love. There's always more to build." He smiled. Not the forced kind, but the one that comes when something breaks inside you and heals in the same breath. Later that day, he went to the community center. People gathered quietly, some with flowers, others with stories. No one called it a loss. They called it a presence, one that didn't fade, only moved. He placed her notebook on the table near the window, beside a pot of daisies. The sunlight caught the edges of the page, illuminating the words until they seemed to breathe. When he looked up, the sky outside was clear again. The clouds had drifted apart, and the light, that same patient, steady light, filled the room. He took a slow breath and whispered under his breath, "She's not gone, she's just everywhere now." And as the day unfolded, the city carried her rhythm. In every cup of tea, every quiet act of care, every small beginning she'd left behind. The light didn't leave. It simply passed through him. The light didn't leave. It simply learned a new way to stay. Months passed, soft and unannounced. Grief, he learned, was not something to conquer. It was something to carry differently each day. Some mornings it felt heavy. Other days almost invisible, like dust caught in sunlight. The flat remained the same, her chair by the window, the kettle in its familiar place, the faint scent of lavender that never quite faded. James didn't change much about it. He couldn't. The space felt like a conversation still happening, one word at a time. Every morning, he brewed 2 cups of tea, one for himself, one for her. The second would sit untouched, steam curling into the quiet. It wasn't ritual. It was memory made visible. At the community center, her absence was its own presence. The others noticed it too. Someone had placed her photo near the window beside the daisies. She was smiling in it, not the wide, camera-ready smile, but the small, knowing one. The kind that said, "I see you trying, and that's enough." James began to take over some of her small routines. He learned how to organize the donation lists, how to listen without interrupting, how to pour tea with both hands when someone's were trembling. He never announced himself as the founder. People already knew. But they didn't treat him like one. They treated him like her. Someone who stayed late to sweep the floor. Someone who remembered names. Once, a young man came to him after a workshop, nervous, thin, holding a folder too tightly. "Sir," he began, "I just wanted to say, the fund, it changed my life." He shook his head gently. "No, you did that yourself. We just helped you believe you could." The young man smiled. "That's what your mom used to say." He didn't reply, just nodded, the words landing softly like a feather against glass. At home, he'd often find her notebook on the table, opened to that final page. Keep building. Keep beginning. The ink had faded slightly, but he could still trace the curve of her handwriting with his fingertip. Strong, certain, patient. He started writing below her words. Not to overwrite, just to continue. Keep listening. Keep giving. Keep going. Every addition felt like a conversation carried forward. One afternoon, while helping at the center, he saw a young girl struggling with a broken mug, tea spilling across the counter. She looked ready to cry. James reached over, steadying her hand before she could speak. "It's all right," he said gently. "It's just a cup. Tea still finds its way." She laughed a little, embarrassed, and he realized it wasn't his voice he had heard. Not really. It was hers, echoed through him. That night, back home, he sat by the window again. The city pulsed softly below, familiar and vast. The sky was clear, the kind of deep blue that arrives before spring. He could almost hear her in the hum of the kettle, in the small creak of the floorboards, in the rhythm of his own breathing. He poured his tea, took a slow sip, and placed the second cup by the sill. The steam rose between them, joining the cold air, dissolving but never vanishing, just like her. As the first drops of rain began to fall, he whispered, not as a prayer, but as a truth. "You taught me how to build, but more than that, you taught me what to hold." The rain tapped gently against the window, like a reply. In the morning, he returned to the center carrying a new sign for the front desk. It was small, hand-painted, the letters uneven but full of care. It read, "The Legacy of Quiet Hands." He placed it beside the daisies. The sunlight caught it just as the kettle began to whistle in the kitchen. And for the first time since she'd gone, he didn't make 2 cups of tea. He made 1 and shared it with everyone. Morning came with the gentlest kind of light, the one that doesn't rush, just arrives. The sign outside the center gleamed faintly under it, "The Legacy of Quiet Hands." It had been 3 years. The daisies by the window had been replaced twice, maybe 3 times, but they still bloomed the same way, quietly, steadily, without needing to be noticed. The center had grown, so had the people. The walls carried laughter now, the hum of everyday victories. There were new faces, new names, and among them, James moved with calm certainty, less a leader, more a presence. He'd become what his mother once was, the quiet axis around which small worlds turned. He didn't need titles anymore. He had learned that true influence doesn't announce itself. It settles softly, like light through curtains. One winter morning, a young woman named Grace arrived. Tired, holding a toddler on hip, a folder clutched tightly in her other hand. Her eyes carried the familiar mixture of hope and exhaustion. "I don't even know where to start," she said, her voice cracking slightly. James smiled, the kind of smile that didn't demand one in return. He said, "Start small. Small things are honest things." She blinked, the words unfamiliar yet comforting. "That sounds right." He gestured towards the table. "Let's have some tea. Things always look clearer over tea." She laughed softly, the first sound of relief. "That's something my mom used to say." He smiled again quietly. "Mine too." The kettle began to hum in the background, filling the air with that soft, familiar rhythm. Steam rose, curling between them, carrying warmth and memory in equal measure. Later, as Grace spoke, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, James listened. Not to the plans, not to the worries, but to the pauses. That was where truth lived. When she left, she carried more than a signed form. She carried steadiness, the kind that lingers, unseen until the next beginning. That evening, James stayed late at the center, tidying up, turning off lights. The hall was quiet now, the air still warm with the scent of tea. On the wall above the window hung a small framed photo of his mother, not large, not gilded, just her, sitting by the window, holding a cup, half smiling at something unseen. He stood before it for a long moment. "We did it, Mom, and it's still happening." Outside, the street lamps flickered on, one by one, small lights finding their place, just like always. He walked to the window, looking out at the city. Somewhere in the distance, rain began to fall again. Not heavy, just enough to blur the lights, make them shimmer. He remembered her voice then, as clear as the day she'd stood in his kitchen all those years ago. "You can start again from where you stopped, but only if you stop fighting the silence first." He smiled. "I stopped fighting, Mom. I just started listening." He turned, ready to lock up, when he noticed something. A little boy, maybe 6, standing near the door, holding his mother's hand. She was one of the new volunteers. The boy stared up at the photo on the wall. "Who's the lady?" he asked. James crouched down beside him. "Someone who built things that lasted." The boy frowned. "Like buildings?" James smiled. "No, like people." The boy nodded solemnly, as if understanding something much bigger than his years. "She looks nice." She was, still is. The boy smiled, tugging his mom's sleeve. "Can we come back tomorrow?" "Of course," she said. When they left, the door closed gently behind them. James looked once more at the photo, the steam still rising from a half-finished cup of tea on the counter. The city beyond the window glowed, 1,000 small lights, each one carrying a story, each one touched, somehow, by the hands that had once poured tea, offered warmth, and reminded a broken world to keep building. He turned off the last light, the room fading into quiet gold. And as he stepped outside, the night air met him, cool, steady, familiar. He looked up at the sky, where dawn's first blush waited beyond the dark. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Keep building, keep beginning." And somewhere, in the hum of the city, in the quiet between breaths, in the lives still unfolding, the echo of her voice carried on. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Unbreakable Mom and press the bell icon